My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are in the midst of a thematic study of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is number 77 in that series. We've been looking at the present passive indicatives that are used by Paul in this great chapter. And we're going to begin today with some linguistic studies of some of the key words that Paul uses. Years and years ago, when I began to really analyze 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I realized that some of the key words, the foundational words that Paul uses to talk about resurrection and the body, it became apparent to me that those words do not in any way, shape, form, or fashion support the idea of a physical resurrection. You have to completely redefine the words in order to support that. Now then, let's begin our analysis of the linguistics, some of the key words, terms, phrases, if you please, that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 when he talks about the resurrection. And in verse 42, Paul says, so also is the resurrection, when he's talking about the glory of this and the glory of that, and the different natures of animals and man, etc., etc. So he says, so also is the resurrection of the dead. It, and that it is the body of verse 35, that singular body that he introduced. Some will say, with what body singular are they plural raised, or are literally being raised? Now watch this. It, the body, is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. Now in the first place, as we have shown, Paul's discussion of the dead ones is reference to the Old Covenant saints. He is discussing them as the body. He never has focused, never has even raised the issue of a human corpse. It is eisegetic, therefore, to introduce that concept in there. That's the first point. But what I really want to get at here is Paul's use of the word corruption. This is from the Greek word phthora. What is absolutely fascinating about this text, word, it's only used 9 times in the New Testament. Twice it speaks of perishing or destruction, being destroyed, Colossians chapter 2:22, for instance. And here's what you've got to realize. You've got to catch the power of this. Phthora, outside of those 2 instances, when contextually considered, used 9 times, and apart from the 2 times in which it is used of being destroyed, the other 7 occurrences refer to moral corruption. It refers to a life antagonistic to God, having nothing, listen to me, nothing whatsoever to do with biological substance. In Romans 8, Paul said that the entire creation would be delivered from corruption. Now look, I understand that most commentators say, oh, that's physical corruption. Well, that's a debatable issue. I reject that. I don't have time to demonstrate that Paul is not talking about biological substance. But let me read to you just a couple of other texts here. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, Paul said, if a man sows to the flesh, he shall of the flesh reap corruption. Wait a minute. The result of living after the flesh would be corruption. Wait a minute. I thought the inherent nature of flesh was corruption. No, Paul says, if you sow to the flesh, and he's not talking about if you sow to physical bodies. Paul is using the word flesh here as a life antagonistic to God. And he says, if you sow to the flesh, you shall of the flesh reap corruption, moral corruption. Folks, once again, it has nothing to do with biological substance. Then, remarkably, Peter says, and he spoke of those who had been converted to Christ, and through the knowledge of Christ, he said, now watch this, this is incredible, they have escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Wait a minute. If corruption is biological substance, then Peter is talking about those who through faith had already been resurrected out of biological corruption. No. Same thought as in Galatians chapter 6. They were living after the flesh. By living after the flesh, living a life opposed to God, they were living in corruption. But through faith, by accepting Christ, by obeying Christ, guess what? They had escaped the corruption of the world. But Peter's not through. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12, he spoke of those who were living that kind of life, and they were worthy to be taken and destroyed. That's one of those instances in which corruption means, destruction. Then he says in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12, they shall utterly perish in their corruption. Well, what kind of corruption is he talking about? It's not biological corruption, because if he was, look, every human being is going to perish in physical corruptibility. The human biological body is going to die. But Peter is saying here that these people living a life after the flesh, they would perish in their corruption. In what? In their moral depravity, in that life opposed to God. And finally, Peter closes out and says in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 19, while they offer them liberty, these are antinomians, and Peter is saying, while they offer their adherents liberty, they are themselves servants of corruption. Well, aren't we all, as human beings, in biological bodies, servants of corruption? Aren't we subject to decay biologically? Well, of course we are, but that is not Peter's point. Peter's point is they were subject, they were slaves, kind of like Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 33, of whom a man is overtaken, of him he is brought into bondage. Here's Peter saying, they are themselves these servants of corruption. How are they the servants of corruption? Because they've given themselves over to live a life after the flesh, to live a life in violation of God's law. Now look, here is Paul, and here is Peter. When they use the word corruption, they do not use it in the context of biological, physical, human weakness. They use it in the sense of moral corruption, a life opposed to God. Now, unless Paul is radically altering, and when we look at the word aphathora in corruption, you're going to see he's not, but unless Paul is radically altering the definition of phathora as he himself uses it, as Peter uses it, when he says, so also is the resurrection, the body is sown in corruption, phathora, it is raised in incorruption. Unless he's radically altering the definition as used everywhere else in the Scripture, then he's not talking about human biological substance. He's not talking about the fact that this stuff will one day decompose in the dust. And if Paul is not talking about a human body decomposing, then the futurist view of the body being sown in corruption is completely falsified. And look, if you want a really, really good, brief, succinct, easily understood study, I've already told you about this book. And boy, the response to this book has been fantastic. The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ by Daniel Rogers. Well, you'll really like this. Thank you so much for joining me. And boy, you're going to love it as we continue our linguistic analysis of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. We'll see you on the flip side.